Hello, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Perspectives on Composition, Pop Culture, and Information Literacy in the Gen Ed Classroom. My name is Danny Shapiro, and I'm on the marketing team here at Hawks Learning. Our speaker today is Professor Shep Shepard of Florida State College at Jacksonville. Professor Shepard studied film, sequential art, and literacy theory at the University of Florida, where he received both his master's degree and PhD in English. He has been an English professor at Florida State College at Jacksonville's North Campus and Nassau Center since spring of 2004. Professor Shepard has also been a longtime contributor to Hawks Learning's English materials. Hawks arranged this webinar for Professor Shepard to share some of his expertise with our community of English instructors from across the country. At Hawks, we understand the value of partnering with faculty in order to create and maintain high-quality course materials. We believe that your expert insight is invaluable. We are very excited that Professor Shepard is here with us today. If you have any questions during the webinar, please enter those into the Q&A box located on the panel at the top or bottom of your screen, and we will address them at the end of the talk. And on that note, I would like to hand it over to our presenter.
Hi, I'm Shep Shepard. As Danny said, I teach at Florida State College at Jacksonville. This presentation kind of was born out of a conversation I had with a longtime person I've worked at Hawks for a long time, Laura Brown, who is now the manager of new course development. We were talking about readers for Composition 2 and how our college kind of uses that course to enhance students' abilities to incorporate sources into their writing and to write more academically. And some of our conversations led us to some interesting places, so she thought this might be interesting to a lot of other people, so I hope you do find it interesting. The way I've structured my presentation today, I thought I'd give you a little bit of background information on me and my institution. Then I will talk a little bit about how we do composition at FSCJ, and what we've transformed our second composition course into, and how I've used that course sort of as a popular culture course to hopefully engage students more directly and also make sure that they are able to incorporate sources into their writing. So we'll start with a little overview of where I teach and where I live. Jacksonville, Florida is in the north of Florida. You may have heard of us because we've been made a little bit infamous from the show The Good Place. There's Jason on my screen there next to the arrow. He's a guy from Jacksonville who sort of the show lovingly makes fun of him. He's a kind of a idiot savant, I guess. He loves the Jacksonville Jaguars, the football team here. There's a picture there of Gardner Minshew, our latest. He's our quarterback because our quarterback, Nick Foles, just went down and got injured, and this guy's a character. He's a rookie, 6th round draft pick, and he's sort of become a meme across the country right now because of his goofy ways and his mustache. We're also famous for Leonard Skinner, and there's a picture of the band in the bottom right corner. You might not know, we are the largest city by area in the contiguous United States. We're really spread out though, and we don't have much of an urban center. My college itself serves, we actually have 4 campuses and 3 satellite centers spread out across the city. And you can sort of tell how spread out we are by that map on the left there. We serve 50,000 students, around that number. It's been up to 52, 53,000, probably max. We were a community college for years. We started out as FJC, then we became Florida Community College at Jacksonville. And in 2006, we became Florida State College at Jacksonville. And we started offering some 4-year degrees that are complementary to both JU and UNF. We don't compete with them, but we offer some degrees that they don't offer, 4-year degrees, like in digital media is one of them that I've sort of had some connections with. I teach now at the Nassau Center at probably the northernmost campus of the college, although I live in Atlantic Beach, so I drive about an hour to work. There are all kinds of opportunities and I guess obstacles to being at a college that's spread out so much. We serve very different populations in the different campuses. More affluent students near the beaches, and then students that struggle more socioeconomically in the north side of town. So the campuses have very different identities. I've taught at 3 of them. I've obviously visited all of them, but they all have unique challenges and opportunities. And I love working here. I love my college. We've had a lot of different administrative teams over the last few years, though. We have a new president that just came in. Seems like a really interesting guy. And we just moved to like a one college model. So we sort of consolidated everything so we're more centralized in the last 2 years, which has led us to some issues, but also I think we're sort of getting our act together in this last couple of years around that model. My own background, I went to the University of Florida for my master's degree and my PhD, and I got a pretty unique education there. We were able to build our English degrees there in ways that some universities, in some ways that other places don't let you build. I studied with a guy named Dr. Alt, who's one of the preeminent scholars of animation and comics in the country. He wrote a number of books about and interview compilations with a guy named Carl Barks, who's famous for doing the Uncle Scrooge comics for Disney. And he's considered one of the greatest sequential art comic artists that's ever lived. So it was really neat to be able to study with Dr. Alt. My focus was really in postmodern theory. I studied Derridian deconstruction, Lacanian psychoanalysis. And my twist on it was that I like to apply it to mainstream superhero comics. My focus being a guy named Frank Miller, who you may have heard of. He's really the reason that Batman has become such a prominent figure in even the cinematic world. His very adult take on Batman was hugely popular and garnered massive amounts of critical acclaim, really helping superhero comics to become a more adult form of literature. And that really, he was coming into prominence at the perfect time for me when I was graduating high school. So I studied his work and applied theory to his work through my undergraduate studies and continued that at the University of Florida. And I focused on comics and sequential art and film through much of my educational experience. I also owned a comic book shop, and that was actually what I wanted to do with my life. From 1999 to 2004, I co-owned and co-managed a shop called The Dragon's Tail in Atlantic Beach. I ultimately left because it was almost impossible to make enough money as a co-owner. So although I'm still very much a patron of comic shops in the area, that opportunity kind of had to be let go. And I became an adjunct professor and then a full-time professor at Florida State College and full-time in 2004. But my heart was really set on being a comic book retailer. The shop that I owned actually stayed in business for another 10 years with the guy that was my partner. But anyway, that will kind of set up some of my interests that you'll find out about when I teach 1102 in just a little bit. In 2016, I got the opportunity to work with Hawks for the first time, and I've had a great relationship with them, and I've really enjoyed the work I've done with them. I had also gotten the unique opportunity in 2006 to work with instructional designers at my college to help build some of our online course offerings. My college is way ahead of a lot of colleges in terms of its online programs. We have an open campus at Deerwood that kind of manages all of our online offerings, and we have a very robust online college. So I was kind of on the ground floor in establishing some of that, which was really exciting. It was very helpful to me to get that instructional design experience, because really when I was when I started as a master's student in the late 90s, I really was handed a composition book and just told to teach. So I had not had a lot of experience building courses and thinking about how that would work. And instructional design is a unique skill that I really enjoy working with the professionals in that area. And I've learned a huge amount. And so I got some of that experience at my own college, and then Hawks furthered that experience with some amazing opportunities to design like learning objects, really complex learning objects, and then lessons and work with graphic design. Really had a great experience with them. So that's lasted really over almost 4 years, and I'm really thankful for it. But that sort of leads me to my discussion of composition itself. The way that Hawks has put some of its courses together are similar, especially with my ENC 1101 experience, our Comp 1 course at Florida State College of Jacksonville. So I'll tell you a little bit about that course. Probably very similar for those of you out there who are English teachers to how a lot of you teach English. We focus on logical patterns in this ENC 1101 course. We all do it differently. I am a very traditional 1101 teacher, teaching rhetorical modes and emphasizing what one of my own professors calls, mastering self-talk for students. I really focus on organizing their ideas and the way in which they can logically transport a reader through their thought process. I build with them from descriptive writing into narration. I have them do some creative writing and narration. And then at the heart of my course, I really figure is the expository lessons, the illustration writing and example writing that I make them do. I try to get them out of just the 5-paragraph essay mode, but certainly a lot of the skills that you learn when you put together intros, thesis statements, body paragraphs, and conclusions, all of that I think is important for my 1101 students, because a lot of them come out of high school, although they've maybe studied literature and stuff, we do see less of an emphasis on the organizational side of writing and of course the grammar side. So really my Comp 1 course is focused on form. And I like to think that it builds vertically so that they start with descriptive writing, which is a part of narration. They then narrate and using narration as examples in their example or illustration writing. And then we move with that basic form of the basic example writing template, they move into argumentative writing, where they basically, sorry, I have a dog here, so he may make some noise. Hey, they basically, Martin, we introduce opposing ideas, opposing viewpoints, and they have to argue with somebody on the other side of the issue. And they also have to start bringing in sources to their writing. Martin, sorry about that. Anyway, I have to take care of them on Fridays. So that brings up citation skills and information literacy. At the end of 1101, our students are expected to present an argument and interact with opposing viewpoints and cite sources. I give them some sources and let them do part of the research process themselves as well. It's always kind of a struggle to get them to organize and use sources, but also, and write clearly, and also understand how to do good research. So I do the best I can with that. Of course, teaching them how to avoid plagiarism and how to be credible in their writing. We only really have time in my 1101 course to do that near the end of the course. And the idea at our school is that you're going to build on those skills in the next English class. So maybe those of you out there who are English teachers also have a system like that with Comp 2. So by the end of 1101, they've now started to incorporate sources, interact with opposing views, and all while being organized and writing academically and formally. Our ENC 1102 course is our Comp 2 course. It's changed pretty radically at the time that I've been at the college. What it used to be was called writing about literary nonfiction. And so we also had a fiction counterpart, which was called Lit 2000, but the legislature made Lit 2000 a humanities course. So we were only left with ENC 1102 that was writing about literacy, and we wanted to change that so that some of our professors could teach a kind of composition/literature course. So we changed it to something called writing about texts. And like I said before, it's supposed to build on the end of 1101, where we have students incorporating outside ideas and outside text into their own writing and writing more formally and academically. This way, now that it's called writing about texts, our instructors can kind of cater to their own strengths. So some of our teachers make it into kind of a traditional literature course, and they have them write about literary forms. Some of our teachers will, for instance, do a completely film-based course. Some of our teachers will go back and do the kind of literary nonfiction, focusing on memoirs and things like that. And it's just sort of up to the individual faculty members, as long as they are making the students write plenty of academic papers that incorporate sources, that's kind of the crux of the course. And we kind of emphasize citation skills and take them through a more in-depth overview of the research process. This has given me an opportunity to kind of come back to the things that I'm interested in, popular culture. I kind of think of it as meeting students where they live. So since so many of them are interested in television and movies and video games and social media experiences, and I'm able to use my course to sort of engage them with those sorts of experiences. So that's how I built my version of the NC 1102. And that's sort of what I wanted to talk about, some of the things that I do in my class that might be of interest to you all, maybe some ideas that you could use in your own classrooms. I start my course, I read this phenomenal book, and I really recommend it, by a guy named Yuval Harari. Hope I'm saying his name right. It's a book called Sapiens. You may have heard of it. It's incredibly critically acclaimed. It's kind of a history of human civilization. And one of his key points is that humans have been able to organize in massive groups much larger than any other species because of their capacity, basically, to narrate the universe and tell stories. And that ability to tell stories and for people to get on board with, their versions of the universe allows people to kind of cooperate in mass in ways that no other species can do. Of course, those stories are competing for attention and lead to all kinds of wars and violence and all kinds of other problems, as well as allowing us to cooperate at mass levels. So I sort of start my course discussing the importance of story and talking about how in our culture, because we are so multicultural, we have all of these competing narratives. And those narratives, of course, get expressed in our popular culture. So that's kind of how I start the course and try to get students on board. I use a book right now called Signs of Life in the USA, although I supplement it with many of my own materials and stuff online to try to discuss popular culture, define it. The book I use is, it sort of does semiotic analysis. It describes what semiotics is, the study of signs. And then it goes through very different entertainment mediums. So it's kind of sectioned off. So there's a section on an opening section that's just about popular culture in general. There's a section on advertising, a section on social media, a section on television, a section on movies, a section on identity. There's a section on like paradoxes and contradictions in American life. I take some of those sections and use them. It's a pretty massive book. It's also very complicated. I really like it a lot, but it's probably meant for students a little bit over the level of my students. So, I struggle with it some because I have to pick the essays that they can understand. Obviously I want to challenge them, but I don't want to completely confuse them. But it really does have it's an anthology, so it has all kinds of different articles from different writers. One of the things that it teaches them to do is identify genre or type and build systems of things. So for instance, one of its early chapters talks about superhero movies, which is exciting to me since I studied mainstream superheroes. And then gets them to think about how within those systems, like in the genre of superhero movies, how do specific films, for instance, differ in some ways from other types of other kinds of films in that genre. And so they sort of learn to think about genre and type and then try to identify differences to say something interesting about the text in question. For instance, in the early chapters, they bring up these two movies, Batman vs. Superman in the DC universe, and Captain America Civil War in the Marvel universe, and talk about in these particular films, the protagonists, the superheroes, are fighting each other. And since they came out around the same time, what might that indicate about the culture that is telling these stories? Why have heroes taken to fighting each other? And we sort of discussed the political process in America and how some of the themes in these movies mirror things that are going on in politics in American life right now. And the students get really pretty engaged with this since they know these films, they know these characters, they've grown up with them, but maybe they've never thought about them seriously. So I find that that's really interesting to see them kind of thinking about the different characters as embodying different ideals or belief systems, and then talking about what it might mean to have these guys fight each other. Talking about superhero movies and genre films leads us to also thinking about how they differ from one another. Leads us also to talk about diversity and cultural change. I've got some images here from, you see Spider-Man there, and the new Spider-Man, Miles Morales, who was in the Spider-Verse movie that came out not too long ago, and student that was wildly popular from Sony. So I present the changing faces of these characters, like in the Star Wars films, when now you have prominent female character as the action role, and Finn, the African American character, or the African I guess he's a stormtrooper who's in that film. Moana, and how Disney princess films have changed over time. We look at that. We look at superheroes, female superheroes like Wonder Woman and Captain Marvel, and how popular they've become. And this is a really nice way to lead into discussion about cultural change and diversity, and why it matters to include people of different kinds of people in the narratives that we tell. This can also lead to some controversial conversations, but they're healthy ones. And again, the students are engaged and they know these different characters, so this can become a really interesting point of conversation. Besides just focusing on things like superhero comics, we also talk about all kinds of different movies and different ideas. We talk about dystopian literature, dystopian images of the future, horror films, and apocalyptic imagery in general. One thing we talk about are images of the non-living. So what I basically do is they read various articles about these kinds of things that I hope that they can draw on for their own writing. And here I just have some of the images and some of the material we talk about. You see the vampire from Twilight, an image from a video game called The Last of Us, the sequel of which is just coming out, which is this kind of mutated zombie-like mushroom creature. The Walking Dead, images from HBO's Westworld science fiction show, and also the Vision and Ultron from the Marvel movies. And we talk about, dystopian visions that involve technology, but then utopian futures, like in the Star Trek series, and Americans' kind of contradictory vision of whether our technology is going to lead to something better for us, or whether it's taking our jobs and kind of leading to disaster, and how these figures help us think about those things while also entertaining us. We also talk about how stories and narratives shape our reality. One of the easy ways to do that is to look at the history of television. So we look at shows like Father Knows Best and Leave It to Beaver and I Love Lucy, and then we compare them to shows like Modern Family to just see where we've come from, or The Simpsons, and how we think of families differently, how we include different kinds of people in those families, how the patriarchy has shifted so that we go from images of the all-powerful father to the Homer Simpson-esque bumbling father, the powerful mother figure now, and a lot of the single mother working moms. And then we also talk about how social media and advertising shapes the world that we live in. And I'm especially interested in showing images of rebellion in advertising, and how youth culture is kind of swept up into buying into rebellion in this kind of way in which you're really just putting money right back into the system you're rebelling against. And we talk about the music industry and how it's connected. So we go from everything from early rock and roll to punk rock, to the grunge movement, to gangster rap and hip hop, and how that stuff starts maybe in a certain authentic space and then becomes bought into. And how does that how does it kind of push boundaries and change reality, but then sort of manifest the same old in terms of our economic reality. And then certainly social media has played this huge part in their lives and just in the culture in general. So we talk about, how in some ways you're encouraged to be your own little celebrity and media content producer when you're on the different social media platforms. And we discuss that, and they're happy to talk about their own experiences with that. And that becomes kind of fodder for writing assignment when I have them write about advertising and social media. They can either write about advertising campaigns or write about how they have themselves become a kind of advertisement for their own lives. And that becomes pretty exciting and interesting. And then the course sort of, I guess, reaches a critical point when we move towards, and I don't go into this in massive detail, but we talk about postmodernism and how a lot of the things that we've led up to at this point have pointed to kind of a hazy distinction between reality and fiction. I make reference back to artists like Andy Warhol, and of course his famous pop art, and where he started to ask questions about what counted as art. We talk about music and sampling, And I think a lot of our students, when it comes to things like plagiarism, they live in a world in which, you know, you think about music production where you're drawing from previous productions of music. Their understanding of where the line between, you know, creativity and copying comes, where that line is, and, you know, how intellectual property works and how that's connected maybe also to the economy. Those conversations get really interesting, especially when I'm also teaching them about how to cite properly and what it means to respect people's ideas. So that becomes part of our classroom conversation. It's interesting right now, our president is an ex-reality star and also worked with the WWE, the World Wrestling Entertainment Company, with Vince McMahon. You see a picture there with Stone Cold Steve Austin, the wrestler. I've always been really interesting in wrestling and how it blurs the line between fiction and reality. So I use wrestling as another way to talk about how, you know, in the old days, wrestling was fake, but it was presented as real. And in many ways, I think it was way ahead of its time, because now we see social media platforms, for instance, people who create identities there and catfish people, or the way in which social media has blurred that line as well. And I think it's fascinating that our president comes from the tradition of wrestling and from reality TV that blurs the line between fiction and reality. And to what extent has he learned to do that himself? And so we talk about that. More recently, I've been interested in some things like augmented reality games and creepypastas, these sort of urban legends that are created online. You'll see an image there, and I would highly recommend a lot of you out there check this out if you've never heard of it. Something called Pets Cop, which is it looks like it's a video game playthrough that is narrated by, it's on YouTube, and the protagonist is sort of talking about playing this game. It's a completely fabricated game that has been meticulously created by whoever these anonymous creators are. And this guy is going through and playing this game that was never officially released, and it sort of becomes a horror urban legend experience. But it's also very deep. It talks about the nurturing of children and the nature of child abuse, and it really has these fascinating sub-themes and you know, connotative ideas in there that are worth discussing, I think. And of course, the students are far more versed in this stuff than I am. But so they'll bring up other experiences that are like this, where you have to kind of watch that, you kind of piece together the narrative as you go. And you also have to pay attention to the very frame of the narrative, like what's put up on the YouTube channel that gives you clues about what this is all about. So I've had students write exclusively about like YouTube channels. Instead of just writing about traditional television and movies, they write about YouTube personas and YouTube channels, or augmented reality games that involve websites and YouTube videos and even video games and television programs all together, creating a kind of reality. It's been really fascinating to me. So all of those things kind of culminate in my class near the end when they do their big research project about something in our popular culture. Usually they write about a movie or a video game, but that's expanded out to some other types of media as well, as I've kind of developed the course and it's moved forward. And I guess I'll just sort of end with this. I don't know if you've heard about the recent controversy over this Joker movie that's coming out, but I just had a conversation with my class about this. If you don't know, this is a movie starring Joaquin Phoenix about Batman's villain, the Joker. There are fears that it has inspired certain subgroups on the internet to act out and perhaps even go to movie theaters and cause and perhaps intend violence. So there's been a lot of warnings. Even the armed forces have warned some of their members to watch out about going to this film, and it's sort of gone viral. And it's fascinating. If you look into it, there's been all these Twitter bots that seem to have jumped on the marketing campaign. And so it's so interesting, if I'm talking to my class about the blurring of fiction and reality, this movie and its marketing campaign seem to be caught up in that. And if it's true that that the only bad publicity is no publicity, this movie is right now getting what I would call very bad publicity about its potential for inspiring violence. But in a way, it's also being marketed by that. So it's becoming infamous before it's even been released. And that conversation has just been my most recent one with my students. So what I do in my class, basically in 1102, to kind of, over the course of the semester, I present a number of readings about these ideas, usually sectioned off by genre. So one time we'll have a section where we talk about critics that write about television, and a section about critics that write about advertising, and a section on movies, and a section on social media. And we'll read those articles, and then I will get them to apply what they've learned in those articles, to explain in the opening part of their paper those articles and cite the articles properly, and then go on to apply those ideas to whatever they've chosen to write about, be it a film, be it an advertising campaign or a TV show or their own social media feed, whatever. I get them to write about those things using the ideas from the sources they've read, and then ultimately ones that they found themselves going through the research process. And that's sort of, I build my expectations for them. We start off where they're just citing the book, and then they have to bring in an outside article in the book, and then ultimately they have to bring in 5 sources they found online. I have them write 4 to 5 papers over the course of the semester, 4 to 5 pages long a piece, all of them using outside sources. And I have them both write them, and then I give them feedback and have them revise them over the course of the semester, hoping to build their information literacy skills, and hoping. I really like them citing the articles that I give them, since I'm so familiar with them, and since I can then really check the way that they cite them, make sure they paraphrase properly, make sure I know that they understand what they're reading. And then I do my very best to bring in outside sources as well by the end, although I really think of this course, even 1102, as focused more on citation than research. They get so much of that research stuff when they end up going into specific disciplines that they focus on. So that's sort of how I do ENC 1102. And when I was talking to Laura from Hawks, one of the things that we talked about was how it'd be nice. I'm always looking, although I love my book, I would love to find a reader that maybe was more catered toward the level of my second year college students, that's maybe meets them a little more. Really, I teach community college, so that meets them a little bit more on where they live. That's maybe not quite as theoretical. So I'm hoping maybe I can find at least some outside stuff to supplement that kind of reaches their level. When you teach 2-year college, that's always kind of your struggle with materials. Can you find something that really talks to the students that you're teaching? But I'd love to maybe even be a part at some point of developing a reader that kind of reaches those students and does discuss popular culture. So anyway, that's sort of my experience teaching composition, my perspective on how I do ENC 1102 and build on 1101. That's about the gist of my presentation. So I'd be happy to field some questions if anybody had any.
Thank you so much, Professor Shepard. I want to remind our audience that you can ask questions in the question and answer box. Again, that panel is located at the top or bottom of your screen. We already have a couple questions coming in here. I believe you addressed this, but is your 1102 your freshman composition course, or is it second year students?
It's our second English course, so they could potentially take it as a freshman. It just depends on how they decide to kind of structure their courses. Sometimes I think our advisors typically have them do it, one after the other. So I get a lot of my 1101 students go directly into 1102. So I do teach that as a lot of them as freshmen, but some of them are sophomores when they take it too.
Okay, thank you. And Becky also would like to know, does your college include the theme or focus on individual course sections in the class schedule?
Our course outline for 1102, I guess both 1101 and 1102, yes, we can include the theme if you mean when we sort of advertise to the students. In fact, I have a lot of friends in the humanities courses that do this more openly. I typically just present it as writing about texts, but we can include the theme as well. And that is helpful because certainly some students may not be interested, I guess, in popular culture. And it's more important, I think, even the humanities courses that focus specifically like on the horror film genre or something like that. So it's kind of an option. You can just have it be the generic 1102 language, or you can include thematic language as well.
Okay. And Brenda says she loves the idea of a reader that meets students where they are. She asks if anything is in the works. Brenda, I don't want to make any promises, but I know we are looking at potentially developing a reader. So we hope that will be something down the line that we will have available. We do feel like we offer some readings and texts throughout our English materials that really are geared towards meeting the students where they are. So while we don't have a reader, that is a focus of ours in our materials and courses that we offer. And a question from Molly. She says, how do your students understand and comprehend Harare's writing style? I had mixed results using this book in my community college English 2 course.
I only use it at the beginning of the course, and I only present them with some excerpts from it. So I do think that it would probably give them some fits, although I think he's a great writer. So I sort of draw from the early parts of the book to kind of set up the pop culture side of my class, and I don't require them to read the book. I give them some excerpts from it. And then I supplement my reader, my Signs of Life in the USA textbook with his insights to kind of make a case for why we're going to talk about all these narratives in my class.
And Natalie says that she noticed you say that you include many readings. She asked if you also show clips from film, and how do you use other types of text and media in your classroom?
Yeah, I show, usually we'll do a thing on sitcoms, so we'll watch a 20-minute sitcom. I show excerpts from film. We do some stuff with YouTube videos that we'll watch. I don't do a lot of stuff like build wikis and things in my class, although some of my colleagues are really good at doing those kinds of things. I focus more on the traditional literature, although we do talk about video games and video gaming. And my students, I mean, that's in many ways, for many of them, I would call that their literature. And we will watch sometimes some My Play videos, people going through those kinds of gaming things, some gaming sites on YouTube. I guess YouTube is kind of the more, if you want to call that an alternative media, that's probably the one that we kind of interact with most in class, in my classroom.
And Daphne asks, can you talk a little bit more about social media feed assignments, especially as tied in with rhetorical modes?
I guess if I want to talk about the way I use social media, I tie it in with my advertising section. So we talk about social media alongside marketers because I'm interested in the way the students are marketing themselves as personas on social media. So my assignment for them is kind of an alternate assignment, is for them to, after talking about the different ways in which marketers use signs to convince people to buy, and that may also involve the signs of gender, the signs of, again, I have a whole section on marketing rebellion. How do they market themselves using those same tactics? So the paper that they do is basically laying out first, explaining those tactics and citing what we've talked about in class and the articles that we've read, and then matching them up with their own social media feeds, like their Facebook pages or their Instagrams and their tweets, and how they construct a persona that way. That's how I use social media. That's the one section that I've kind of started focusing on with social media.
Oliviera asks, do you offer TED Talk speeches as an outside source to support a student's thesis?
I have had students use those when we do our final research project as one of their sources. We actually have a whole TED Talks thing at FSCJ, a guy that runs that, where the students can go and we have speakers, we have some TED Talks panels too. I don't think I've had students actually use the ones from the school that way, but I have used them had them use them as sources in their writing. And it's always great because then of course I can teach them to cite that kind of a source in their works cited page and things like that. So yeah, I have had them use them as sources, some of those presentations.
And Brenda is curious about use of hip hop in your course. Which artists do you highlight when you touch on hip hop?
I don't use music as much as I used to in my class. Certainly we've had discussions about artists like Kendrick Lamar, Drake. They are more encouraged to do that if they would like to do it in the classroom. When I taught at North, I had a lot more interest in hip hop, and that was several years ago. And so they would bring that to me. Of course, I'm no expert in that field. So I discuss it, especially when we talk about the marketing of music and rebellion, and how hip hop has also become a central way in which like kid advertising has kind of incorporated images and a lot of the media constructs from hip hop in its advertising. We have a whole article about that. And then I've had a couple of students write on certain personas like Kendrick Lamar, this one I can think of. But I guess that it's not a whole section of my class, at least at this point. Not that I would be averse to doing that.
And Roseanne says that she's really glad to hear that you teach the Harare Text. She says she's teaching 21 lessons for the 21st century and her students love it. She was afraid that it would be too dense, but they seem to be identifying with a lot of it, and she supplements it with additional articles and readings. She said it touches on a lot of the same themes that you mentioned, and she was torn which chapters to assign. Her question is, do you find that there are some themes that get your students, more of your students' attention than others?
Oh, that's a good question. You know, my students are really interested in some of the questions about technology, I think. We discuss like the singularity in my class, you know, that tipping point with AI where either AI is going to dominate, you know, become like basically become human civilization or merge with humanity and perhaps lead to this utopian future. Students really get engaged with that conversation. And I know he touches a lot on technology and the future of technology and what it means for us and how it's going to connect to our economic systems. I found my students become really engaged with that. And they also get really engaged with questions about, when we talk about narrative, about you know, that line between fiction and reality. So I guess I kind of think about those things merging when you think about the merging of technology and humanity and the way in which our networks are sort of building our realities. I get excited about that. I think they get kind of excited about that too. So at least in my own experience, those questions about technology have been what's really galvanized some conversations in class.
Anissa asks, do you discuss toxic masculinity alongside the pop culture, social media, and comic book issues presented in the course?
That has become more and more a part of the conversation for sure. In fact, this conversation about the Joker has involved some of those conversations. And again, the incel community, the involuntary celibate group that is sort of behind the fears about the Joker movie, that leads directly to those kinds of conversations about toxic masculinity. Also talking about the inclusion of like characters like, you know, these incredible superheroines like Captain Marvel, and Wonder Woman, and what those refigured forms mean. You know, there's pushback by some of the I guess fans in those communities about, you know, you're being force fed this new version of gender and things like that. So we have conversations about that for sure. I find that the students, luckily, are in my classes have been very civil about it, and we also kind of use humor and things to discuss it, but certainly that has to be part of the conversation. I'm glad you bring that up when you talk about these figures, these superhero figures.
Oliviera also asks, do your students write the rhetorical analysis? She says that she's noticed a lot of students cannot grasp this analysis very well, but it's super important.
Yeah, I would say that my students, if what we're talking about is being able to read into things, the connotative meaning of things and analyzing that, I find that my students have a lot of, my best students, of course, come kind of equipped to deal with that. But getting students to write about that second level of meaning and analyze it and explain it to me has been a real struggle for me. One of the reasons I use pop culture is because they are so familiar with some of these narratives that at least I have a point of engagement with them where I can try to get them to think about that second level of meaning and what things, you know, indicate about the culture. But that is one of my great struggles, and as well as getting them to incorporate sources into their writing in a way that makes sense and that's ethical and academic. So yeah, I have trouble with them. That is definitely, and so hopefully my hope is that by reading these articles and going through some of that analysis with them, talking about things they're familiar with and drawing up analysis together and then kind of like putting together like outlines of what you would do if this was your paper. Hopefully that gets, I always hope that moves them somewhere. And then having them revise, I'm a big believer in revising papers. So I give them a lot of feedback. I don't have them write really long papers. Have them write complex papers, and then I give them feedback, and then I regrade the papers. And it takes a lot of time, but I feel like I need to give them that instruction and give them that opportunity to work with like an editor and get them to see where they're going wrong. And I think that they seem to really appreciate that. And I do see a lot of movement by the end of the course because of that give and take relationship with the students.
Okay, thank you again, Professor Shepard. We are just about out of time. I'm sorry, I know we still have some questions coming in. I think we could continue this conversation all day, so I want to say thank you very much to the audience for a lively Q&A session. We really appreciate your participation. If you do have any questions overall, please direct them to us at marketing@hawkslearning.com. We will be emailing everyone out a link to view this webinar on demand, and I hope everyone has a great rest of their day, and thank you again to Professor Shepard.
Thank you.